When the legions of Rome finally departed from Britain in the early 5th century, they left behind more than empty forts and abandoned villas. They left behind a land on the edge of transformation, where an empire's order had dissolved into uncertainty, and a new age, one we now call the Dark Ages, began to take root. It is a period often cloaked in shadow and myth, remembered as a time of chaos, poverty, and ignorance. But the truth, as always, is far more intricate and far more human. Life in Dark Age Britain was not lived only on battlefields or in the echo of collapsing cities. It was lived in small wooden huts, in muddy villages, in smoky halls lit by flickering firelight. It was lived in the quiet routines of ordinary people, tending sheep, grinding grain, mending tools, raising children. And within these humble details, we can uncover a reality more fascinating than the blood-soaked legends of kings and conquerors. So tonight, we are not chasing warriors across windswept fields, nor are we looking only at the thrones of long forgotten rulers. Instead, we are stepping into the lives of the people who made up the vast majority of Dark Age Britain. The farmers, the craftsmen, the families whose stories rarely survive in chronicles, but whose resilience shaped the very fabric of their world. Picture this: a damp morning in a small settlement, somewhere in what is now rural England. My low over piece rough thatched roofs. A woman rises before the sun, stirring the embers in her hearth back into flame. She pulls on a coarse wool tunic, the fabric scratchy but warm against the chill, and begins her day by baking bread from barley meal, the staple food of her household. Her children, still drowsy, help fetch water from a nearby stream, carrying it in clay jars balanced carefully against their hips. Outside, her husband tends to livestock, lean sheep with thick, oily wool, and pigs that root noisily in the undergrowth. This is a scene repeated not once, but hundreds of thousands of times all across Britain, day after day, generation after generation. It was a life of simplicity, yes, but also of fragility. A failed harvest could mean hunger, a harsh winter could bring death, and sickness often carried away the young before they had even seen adulthood. And yet, in the middle of such uncertainty, there were still moments of community, of joy, of celebration. A wedding feast with roasted meat and ale, a festival marking the turning of the seasons, a shared story told by firelight that stitched people together in memory and myth. We tend to think of the Dark Ages as an age without light, but light was everywhere, in the glow of hearths, in the flicker of torches, in the dawn that still broke over green hills and wild forests. Life was hard, but it was not joyless. It was survival, yes, but it was also culture, belief, and identity. Over the course of this journey, we will walk slowly through the hidden corners of Dark Age Britain. We will look at what people ate, how they dressed, what their homes were like. We will explore how they understood death, how they healed wounds, and how they explained the mysteries of the world around them. And as we peel back the layers, we'll discover that behind the grand tales of kings and warriors, life was carried forward not by the sword, but by the hand that tilled the soil, baked the bread, and nursed the sick. So, as you settle in for the night, I invite you to imagine yourself in that world, a Britain where the Roman villas stand as ruins, their mosaics cracked and fading, while nearby, new wooden halls rise from the earth. A Britain where Latin is fading and new tongues, early English, Celtic, Norse murmur in the air. A Britain where history was not written down by the common folk, but lived in their sweat, their songs, their stories whispered from parent to child. Stay with me until the end, and you will see Dark Age Britain not through the lens of myth or the judgments of later ages, but through the eyes of the people who truly lived it. For in their small routines, in their quiet struggles, and in their moments of resilience, lies the real story of what life was like when Britain stood between the collapse of Rome and the dawn of the medieval world. And that, perhaps, is the greatest secret of all, that even in the so-called darkest of ages, life still glowed with the quiet persistence of humanity. Part 1, Homes and Settlements. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a Britain that had just lost its empire. The Romans packed up, took their sandals and their mosaics with them, and left behind a country that was, well, let's just say, less than prepared for independence. If Britain were a teenager, this was the moment the parents went on permanent vacation, and the teenager immediately forgot how to cook pasta. This is the Britain of the Dark Ages, a land where Roman villas stood in ruins, their hypocaust heating systems gathering moss, and where new kinds of homes and settlements began to rise from the ashes. Not glamorous ones, mind you, no marble columns or painted frescoes, more like wooden huts with thatched roofs and a constant background smell of smoke and livestock. But don't picture absolute misery just yet. Life in these homes was not luxurious, but it was practical. People did what they had to do, and then they did it again the next day. The ordinary rhythms of survival. The hum of a small settlement, the crackle of a smoky hearth, the muddy lanes winding between houses. That's where we're going tonight. So, let's settle in and drift slowly through the homes and settlements of Dark Age Britain. The typical house in this period was, to put it kindly, minimalist. 4 walls, usually of timber, sometimes wattle and daub, basically sticks and mud, politely pretending to be a wall, and a roof made of thatch. Windows were not a standard feature. If you wanted light, you opened the door. If you wanted fresh air, well, good luck. Most homes smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and animals, which sounds unpleasant until you realize that it was simply the smell of life itself. Inside, the floor was often just packed earth. Straw might be scattered across it, partly for insulation, partly because sweeping was overrated. Furniture was sparse. A rough table, some stools, maybe a chest for storage. Beds were not elaborate for posters. More often they were straw, filled sacks, or even a corner of the floor where blankets or animal skins were heaped together. In larger settlements, homes clustered around a central hall. The hall was the heart of the community, where feasts took place, decisions were made, and where everyone tried to pretend they weren't freezing. The hall was not only a social center, it was a survival mechanism. Warmth, food, companionship, everything essential for keeping spirits alive when the world outside was cold and uncertain. Now, one important thing to remember, these settlements were not designed for comfort. They were designed for necessity. Life was precarious. A house was not expected to last forever. Timber rotted, thatch leaked, walls caved in. Repairs were constant, and sometimes, when things got bad enough, it was easier just to build a new hut a few steps away from the old one. Archaeologists often find clusters of collapsed houses where families simply abandoned one structure and shifted next door, like moving house, but without the inconvenience of hiring a car. Fire was both a blessing and a curse. Every house needed it for heat, for cooking, for light, but fire also meant danger. Thatch burns spectacularly well, and settlements were vulnerable to devastating blazes. Imagine living in a village where a single spark could turn half the homes into ash. It gave new meaning to sleeping lightly. Let's drift for a moment into the rhythm of a settlement's day. At dawn, smoke began to curl from chimneys, or rather from holes in the thatch. Chickens clucked in the dirt lanes, pigs rooted in the undergrowth, and people emerged bleary, eyed from their huts. Work began immediately. Fires were stoked, bread was baked, animals tended, fields checked. Children fetched water from streams, while older members of the household spun wool or repaired tools. It was not a life of leisure, but it was steady, and in its own way, comforting. Settlements varied in size. Some were tiny hamlets of just a few families, while others grew into fortified villages or even small towns. But none of them resembled the bustling urban life of Roman Britain. Gone were the stone, built villas, the bathhouses, the orderly streets. Instead, Communities huddled in small clusters, surrounded by fields and woodland. Defenses were often rudimentary. A ditch, a palisade, maybe a simple earthwork to keep animals or raiders out. And yes, raiders were a real problem. Life in the Dark Ages meant living with the constant possibility that one morning your quiet village might be interrupted by a band of strangers with sharp weapons and a bad attitude. It wasn't paranoia. It was Tuesday. But for all its fragility, the settlement was the center of identity. This was your world, your family, your neighbors, your animals, your land. To step beyond it was to risk the unknown. Travel was dangerous, roads were poor, and forests were filled with more than just deer. Wolves still roamed parts of Britain, and human strangers were often less trustworthy than wolves. And yet in the evenings after the day's work was done, there was warmth and companionship. People gathered by the fire, shared food, told stories. The hall, smoky and loud, became a place of laughter, memory, and myth. Stories of ancestors, of gods, of heroes. Perhaps exaggerated, perhaps invented, but serving the same purpose: to give meaning to lives that were otherwise focused on survival. Homes in the Dark Ages were small, settlements were modest, but together they created the framework of life. The place where children were born, where meals were shared, where the seasons turned. Fragile though they were, they carried the weight of survival. And so, as we drift out of this part of the story, imagine lying on a straw bed in one of those huts. Smoke drifting upward to escape through the roof, the sound of pigs settling in the mud outside, the warmth of a small fire, not quite enough to drive out the chill. It is not glamorous, but it is life. Life in Dark Age Britain, carried on in small wooden homes, fragile but enduring. Let's drift gently now toward the next part of our journey, where we'll explore the food, the daily work, and the diets that kept people alive in a world where survival was never guaranteed. Part 2. Food and daily work. Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's drift further into Dark Age Britain tonight. We've already settled into the smoky huts and muddy little villages, and now it's time to think about what actually went into people's mouths and, inevitably, what didn't. Because food in the Dark Ages was both the heart of survival and the constant source of stress. Now, if you're imagining a rich medieval feast with silver platters of roasted swan, goblets of wine, and minstrels strumming politely in the corner, you might want to lower those expectations. We are much earlier here, in a world where most meals were more along the lines of porridge, bread that could chip a tooth, and, on a lucky day, maybe a bit of meat that was only slightly questionable. The main diet revolved around grains: barley, oats, rye. Wheat was around, but it was the VIP grain, finicky, difficult to grow, and often kept for the wealthier classes. For the average villager, porridge was the morning routine, thick, filling, and endlessly repetitive. If you wanted variety, you might add some onions or leeks, or, if it was a festive day, you might treat yourself to a dash of herbs. Imagine eating oatmeal every morning of your life, and then getting genuinely excited when someone sprinkles in a shred of cabbage. That was the culinary highlight. Bread was the other staple, but don't picture fluffy bakery loaves. Dark Age bread was dense, heavy, and often laced with bits of grit from the grinding stones. People's teeth show the damage. Ground down, worn flat, sometimes cracked. Essentially, the bread doubled as both food and dental sandpaper. Convenient, if a little painful. Protein came mostly from animals, but not in the way we might think. Cows were prized for milk rather than meat. Sheep gave wool and pigs, well, pigs did everything. They foraged in the woods, cleaned up scraps, and eventually ended up on the table. Pork was a common treat, salted or smoked to last through the winter. Chickens, too, were useful, though eggs were often more valuable than the occasional stew. Fish played a role, especially near rivers and coasts, but fish was not always a glamorous choice. It was sometimes associated with fasting days or religious rules, making it the holy obligation meal. Imagine looking down at a plate of dried fish and thinking, "Ah yes, spiritual fulfillment." Still, it kept people alive. Now vegetables. There were no tomatoes, no potatoes, no corn. Those would all arrive later from the Americas. Instead, the Dark Age vegetable menu was heavy on leeks, onions, cabbages, peas, and beans. Root vegetables like turnips made regular appearances, though they were usually as bland as the soil they came from. If you were lucky, you might stumble on wild fruits, apples, berries, nuts. But again, dessert was more often a fantasy than a reality. For flavor, herbs were used: garlic, mustard, dill, parsley, but salt was the real treasure. It preserved meat, flavored porridge, and was valuable enough to be traded like currency. If you think modern people are obsessed with fancy salts, remember that in the Dark Ages, salt was less of a lifestyle choice and more of a survival tool. As for drinks, water was complicated. Streams could be clean, or they could be the reason your whole household spent the next week regretting existence. Beer and ale were safer and often weaker than what we imagine today. They were staples, drunk by adults and children alike, not for the buzz, but because they were safer than a questionable puddle. Milk was also common, though it didn't last long without spoiling, so it often became cheese or butter instead. Wine was a rare luxury in Britain, imported and expensive. Most villagers would never taste it in their lives. So that's the diet. But food wasn't just about eating. It was about survival work. Daily life revolved around producing, preparing, and protecting it. Farming was constant labor, plowing fields with wooden plows pulled by oxen, sowing seeds by hand, weeding, harvesting, then threshing, winnowing, grinding. It was endless, and the seasons dictated everything. Spring was hope, summer was labor, autumn was harvest, winter was endurance. Women spent hours preparing meals, grinding grain on quern. Stones was backbreaking work, done daily, often for hours at a time. Baking bread in clay ovens or over open hearths was tricky and smoky. Cooking was never a quick affair. It was labor every single day for food that might still leave you hungry. And of course, food shortages were common. A bad harvest meant hunger. Too much rain, too little sun, and early frost. It didn't take much for disaster to set in. Families stretched what they had: diluted porridge, thinned stews, rationed bread. Malnutrition was not unusual, and children often bore the brunt of it. When food was scarce, people turned to whatever they could find: nuts, acorns, wild plants. Sometimes famine foods things normally avoided, like bark or roots, were eaten in desperation. They filled the belly but did little for health. In extreme cases, entire communities were weakened and mortality spiked. The line between survival and starvation was never far. But there were moments of abundance, too. A successful hunt might bring venison. A pig slaughtered at midwinter was cause for feasting. Festivals were marked by shared meals, where the community came together to celebrate, eat heartily, and forget hunger for a while. These moments mattered. They lifted spirits, reminded people of joy, and gave life a rhythm beyond survival. Now, let's drift into the daily work itself. Beyond farming, there was spinning, weaving, woodworking, tool repair. Every household had tasks, and everyone contributed. Children fetched water, gathered firewood, scared birds from fields. Women spun wool into yarn, wove cloth, made clothing. Men built fences, repaired plows, maintained thatched roofs. It was a life of constant maintenance. Evenings, though, slowed down. After the day's work, people gathered around the fire. Meals were simple: stews of vegetables, bread, maybe a sliver of meat. Stories were told, songs were sung. The crackle of fire, the murmur of voices, the settling of animals outside, it was the daily rhythm of life. Not glamorous, not easy, but steady. And perhaps that steadiness is the secret. Dark Age Britain was not an age of constant disaster, despite the name. It was an age of endurance, of small routines that carried people through. Grinding grain, feeding animals, brewing ale, baking bread. The same tasks repeated endlessly, building a life that was fragile but enduring. So, as you settle in tonight, imagine the taste of that barley porridge, the heavy bread, the smoky stew. Imagine the calloused hands that made it, the tired faces that ate it, the quiet satisfaction of surviving another day. Food and work were not luxuries. They were life itself. And in that life, however repetitive, lay the strength that carried Britain through its so-called darkness. Let's drift, then, from the smoke of the hearth and the scent of porridge, into the deeper rhythms of belief and community, where meals became rituals, where festivals brought people together, and where the spiritual life of Dark Age Britain gave meaning to the endless work of survival. Part 3. Beliefs and Community Life. Hey everyone. Tonight we're still drifting through Dark Age Britain. We've walked among the smoke-stained huts, eaten our fair share of gritty bread, and endured the endless cycle of chores. Now it's time to ask, what did people actually believe in? What gave them meaning when life was basically a series of muddy inconveniences, interrupted occasionally by plague, famine, or the neighbor's pigs breaking into your garden? Because survival was one thing, but survival without belief is a little bleak. Human beings need stories, rituals, reasons why the seasons turn, why the crops fail, why the baby dies and the storm comes. Dark Age Britain was no different. After the Romans left, religion in Britain became, well, complicated. The Romans had brought Christianity with them, neatly packaged and somewhat organized. But once the legions marched away, that fragile structure wobbled like a half-baked pudding. In many places, the old pagan traditions endured. Spirits in the forest, gods in the sky, the sense that every river, hill, or oddly shaped rock had some sort of significance. It wasn't the polished pantheon of Greece or Rome. It was local, practical, and tied to the landscape. People believed in what they could see, or what they feared might be hiding in the dark. If a cow sickened mysteriously, there was probably a spirit involved. If a child fell ill, perhaps an offended ancestor was to blame. Daily life was threaded through with charms, rituals, and the occasional sacrifice, just to keep things running smoothly. And then, of course, Christianity did not vanish entirely. Missionaries from Ireland, from Rome, from all sorts of well-meaning corners of Europe began popping up again, clutching their crosses and declaring that everything people were doing was horribly wrong, which was probably true, but not especially helpful. Conversion was slow, uneven, and often halfway done. One moment a local lord might be baptized, and the next he was still sacrificing a goat to ensure decent harvest weather. This was called hedging your bets. The result was a curious blend. You might see a Christian priest blessing fields in spring, while villagers quietly buried charms under the furrows just in case. A cross might be carved on a standing stone that had once been dedicated to a pagan deity. People didn't see contradictions. They saw insurance policies. If two gods wanted your attention, why not keep them both happy? Now, community life was built around these beliefs. Festivals punctuated the year, marking the seasons, the harvests, the solstices. These were moments of relief, when the endless grind of work paused and people celebrated together. Fires were lit, food was shared, songs were sung, and everyone pretended for a few days that life wasn't mostly about mud and aching joints. Weddings were community affairs too, not the white dresses and tiered cakes we imagine today. More like an exchange of gifts, a gathering of families, and a feast where everyone ate until the salted pork ran out. The church, when it eventually became more involved, tried to regulate things, insisting on proper vows and blessings, but much of marriage remained a social contract enforced by families and neighbors rather than priests. Funerals were solemn but also telling. Early burials often included grave goods, jewelry, weapons, tools suggesting that people believed the dead needed equipment for some sort of afterlife. Later, as Christianity dug in more firmly, the grave goods faded, replaced by simple burials under churchyards. But the persistence of older practices shows how deeply the pagan world you clung on. People weren't quite ready to send their loved ones into the next world without at least a backup spear. And of course, storytelling was the glue of community belief. In the evenings, by the smoky hearth, tales were told. Stories of gods, of ancestors, of warriors who did things that were probably exaggerated beyond recognition. Oral tradition was everything. It carried memory, taught lessons, and, conveniently, made winter nights pass more quickly. These stories weren't just entertainment. They built identity. They told people who they were, where they came from, and what values mattered. Loyalty, courage, generosity, and also not stealing your neighbor's cows because somehow that always came up in heroic tales. Now let's drift into the social bonds themselves. Community life in the Dark Ages was tight-knit. It had to be. Your neighbors were your workforce, your defense, your emergency support system. If your roof collapsed, they helped fix it. If your crops failed, they might lend grain, though probably with the expectation you'd pay them back. Social harmony was survival, which made disputes, of course, all the more entertaining. Arguments over land, animals, or insult were common. And without modern courts, disputes were handled through councils or assemblies, or sometimes just whichever lord could wave the biggest sword around convincingly. Compensation payments, called wergild in Anglo-Saxon law, were meant to keep things civil. If you killed someone, you owed their family a payment. If you injured them, there was a price list. An eye, a hand, even a tooth had a set value. It was justice, but with receipts. Religion wove itself into this, too. Oaths sworn on holy relics, ordeals by hot iron or cold water, all ways of proving guilt or innocence when no one quite trusted anyone else's word. Because nothing says justice like holding a red, hot bar and hoping divine intervention prevents your hand from blistering. The role of elites in community belief is worth a moment. Local lords and chieftains often doubled as spiritual patrons. They funded churches, hosted feasts, upheld rituals. Their status wasn't just military or economic, it was spiritual authority. If a lord seemed blessed by the gods or God, then people trusted his leadership. If misfortune followed him, well, maybe someone else would be better suited. Political legitimacy was deeply tied to spiritual approval, and naturally, royals were no exception. Kings liked to cloak themselves in divine favor. Some claimed descent from gods. Others staged elaborate baptisms to show off their Christian credentials. Of course, the irony was that many kings lived lives that could politely be described as ethically flexible. But as long as the crops grew and the raids were kept at bay, people were willing to nod politely and let the inconsistencies slide. Festivals, again, stitched the year together. The great feasts at midwinter, marking the turning of the sun. The May celebrations of fertility and new life. Harvest festivals, when everyone gave thanks for surviving another round of backbreaking labor. Even after Christianity took stronger root, these festivals didn't vanish. They simply rebranded. Pagan solstice fires became Christmas celebrations. Fertility rites became saints' days. Old habits dressed in new clothes. And so, belief in the Dark Ages was not monolithic. It was layered, improvised, constantly adapting. People prayed to God, carried pagan charms, listened to priests, and still told the old stories. Their world was too uncertain to gamble on one single explanation. Better to keep every option open, every spirit appeased, every god at least mildly satisfied. In the end, belief and community life were inseparable. Religion wasn't an abstract set of doctrines. It was in the planting of seeds, the blessing of fields, the sharing of food, the telling of tales. It was in the way neighbors supported or resented each other. It was the invisible thread that bound survival into meaning. So, as you drift tonight, imagine yourself among them, sitting by the fire, listening to an elder tell the story of a warrior who once fought a monster, or possibly just a very irritated cow. Imagine watching the midsummer fires burn, casting sparks into the night sky. Imagine laying charms in the soil, just in case the priest's blessing wasn't quite enough. This was life in Dark Age Britain, hard, fragile, but threaded through with belief. And with that, let's drift gently onward to the last part of our journey into the shadows of hardship, famine, disease, and violence. And of course, the quiet resilience that somehow carried these people through, century after weary century. Part 4, Hardships and Resilience. Hey everyone, by now, you've wandered through the smoky halls of Dark Age Britain. You've eaten the gritty bread, nodded politely at the village priest while still tucking a pagan charm into your pocket, and listened to the long, slow tales spun out around the hearth. But of course, we can't drift through this age without facing its most persistent companion, hardship. Because life then was not soft, not safe, and not particularly hygienic. It was a world where every year brought a fresh opportunity for famine, for disease, for war, or if the gods were feeling creative, for all three at once. And yet, somehow, people endured. They endured in ways that don't always look graceful to us, but they were enough to keep life moving forward. Let's start with famine. Crops failed regularly. Sometimes it was the weather, too much rain, too little, or just at the wrong time. Sometimes pests, sometimes armies marching through and helping themselves. Grain stores were limited, preservation techniques were crude, and there was no handy grocery market to fill in the gaps. When harvests were poor, diets shrank. Bread grew thinner, gruel more watery. People ate acorns, weeds, and anything vaguely chewable. There are stories of bark being boiled, though one assumes that was a last resort. Meat was scarce except at feasts, or for those wealthy enough to keep it. And of course, children were the most vulnerable. Malnutrition weakened them, and then disease struck. Disease, naturally, deserves its own moment. Plague swept through in cycles, sometimes brought on trade ships, sometimes rising from within. Smallpox, dysentery, leprosy, all names that make the modern stomach turn. Medicine was, let's say, experimental at best. Remedies ranged from herbal concoctions to prayers, to rubbing the afflicted with the bones of saints, if you were lucky enough to have some lying around. If you weren't, well, you made do with mud, spit, or whatever your neighbor swore had worked once. Childbirth was another constant hazard. For women, it was a leading cause of death, and infant mortality was grimly high. A third of children might not see their first birthday. Families compensated by having more children, though this meant mothers lived in a cycle of pregnancy, birth, and grief. It was brutal, yet it was also the ordinary rhythm of life. Then, of course, there was violence. Raids, feuds, wars between rival kings who couldn't agree on which of them God liked best this decade. Whole villages might be burned, livestock stolen, fields trampled. Defense was often a wooden palisade and a prayer. If you survived the battle, infection in your wounds might finish the job. And yet, this is where resilience comes in. People still managed. They adapted. They built tight social bonds because no one could face hardship alone. They shared food when they could. They rebuilt homes after raids. They sang songs, told stories, clung to rituals that reminded them life was bigger than their present misery. One of the most striking things about Dark Age Britain is how ordinary people turned survival into a kind of culture. The feast after harvest was not just a party, it was a triumph, a declaration that, for another year, they had beaten back hunger. The telling of ancestral tales was not just entertainment. It was a way of affirming that endurance was woven into the community's identity. And elites, for all their flaws, also had to embody resilience. Kings and queens fell ill like anyone else. They buried children like anyone else. Some clung to faith, some to violence, most to a mixture of both. A crown did not make life safe, it simply made the hardships more public. Consider the royal obsession with relics. Kings went to extraordinary lengths to collect bones of saints, bits of cloth, or splinters of the true cross. These weren't just holy souvenirs. They were attempts to build a fortress of divine protection around their fragile kingdoms. If you had a saint on your side, maybe your crops would grow. Maybe your dynasty would last, or maybe not, but at least you could impress your neighbors. Resilience also showed up in architecture. Wooden halls might burn, but they were rebuilt quickly. Churches rose from stone, often on top of older sacred sites, as if to say, "This ground has meaning, and it will not be abandoned, no matter how many times the roof leaks." And in the face of death, constant, ordinary, unavoidable resilience was woven into ritual. Funerals, wakes, prayers, charms. These were not just about the dead. They were about teaching the living how to carry on. To remind them that grief was survivable, that the community endured, and that even in a world so fragile, life still pushed stubbornly forward. Let's drift for a moment into the quieter resilience, the small habits of daily endurance. A woman weaving cloth that might outlast her. A farmer planting seeds despite losing the last crop, because what else could he do? A child playing in the dirt while adults worried about the weather. These were acts of stubborn hope, repeated countless times. So ordinary they barely made it into history books. But without them, there would be no history at all. And perhaps the greatest resilience was simply the ability to laugh, to make jokes, even dark ones, about the absurdities of life. A harvest ruined, a king demanding taxes, a pig running off with your last loaf of bread. These were tragedies, yes, but also stories to be told later when the worst had passed. Humor was survival too. So what was life in Dark Age Britain really like? Hard, uneven, relentlessly uncertain, but also deeply human, a mixture of suffering and stubbornness, fear and faith, grief and laughter. People endured not because it was easy, but because it was the only option. And as you drift towards sleep tonight, you might take a strange comfort in that, because if they could keep going century after weary century, through mud and famine and fire, then perhaps endurance is the most ordinary and extraordinary part of being human. Asterisk, and that, my friends, is where we'll leave Dark Age Britain for tonight. A world of mud, smoke, hunger, and the occasional saint's toe bone, yet somehow people carried on. They built, they laughed, they argued with their neighbors about sheep, and against all odds, they laid the foundations for the Britain that would stumble, trip, and occasionally shine its way through history. If you've made it this far, I hope your eyes are heavy, your room is quiet, and perhaps you're a little glad that your dinner tonight didn't involve boiled weeds or questionable porridge. Thank you for drifting through the past with me. If you enjoyed this slow wander, you can always like the video, or even subscribe, though only if you truly want more midnight history rambles. For now, rest easy, sleep well, and remember, if our ancestors could survive the Dark Ages, you can probably survive tomorrow's morning meeting. Good night, asterisk.